You may have noticed that in my videos, I often talk about how humanity's current evolutionary and spiritual struggle has mostly to do with moving from a paradigm of addiction to one of actual wisdom. And because that seems to be such an important thematic in our world these days, it also seems natural that wisdom would be a relatively rare phenomenon. It's basically something we're trying to grasp very awkwardly, I'd say, but which we're pretty far from actually attaining. But the problem is that it's also the very thing our world desperately needs right now. And so I'd like to explore the Sage Archetype with respect to that tension, as something that might help us grow beyond the paradigm of addiction, especially addiction to our own self-importance and dictatorial impulses, and then help us enter into the much wider and more life-affirming terrain of actual wisdom. Anyhow, as usual, we should probably begin with a few basic definitions. Within the context of this video, archetypes have to do with the early mid-20th century psychologist Carl Jung and how he conceived of the unconscious. Basically, archetypes are collections of mythological themes and images that run through a culture and its ancestral past, and that ultimately constitute the unconscious, at the individual level, but also at the collective and cultural levels. There are, of course, many such archetypes in our world. For instance, in my last two videos, I explored the trickster and hero archetypes. But here, I want to explore the Sage Archetype, examples of which would include characters like Gandalf in Lord of the Rings, or Yoda in Star Wars, or Morpheus in The Matrix. Basically, characters who are usually older and who embody a great deal of wisdom and perspicacity. In fact, Webster's defines a sage as... How does Webster's define a sage? One such as a profound philosopher distinguished for wisdom. So, since wisdom is such a definitive characteristic of sages, and hence of the Sage Archetype, let's spend a minute or two exploring what it actually is. At the most basic level, I'd say that wisdom has to do with two interrelated capacities. It involves our ability first to perceive what life is showing us lucidly and accurately, and then to respond to that perception faithfully and harmoniously. And at this point, it's probably also worthwhile to note that wisdom isn't the same thing as intelligence. Instead, wisdom has more to do with our perceptual abilities and our capacity for harmonious action than it does with our knowledge base or our cognitive agility. Consequently, it's entirely possible to be very intelligent, but extremely unwise, and I bet you can think of plenty of examples of that in our world. But on the other hand, it's also possible to be very wise, but not very intelligent. And I think that the character of Forrest Gump would be a pretty good illustration of that. But the point is that, somewhat contrary to popular opinion, wisdom is something very different from raw intellectual horsepower. However, I'd also say that wisdom is holistic in nature. In other words, it involves our ability to see things in terms of the big picture. For instance, realizing that we're participants in the grand totality of life and in the universe as a whole. But it's also about being able to perceive the small details of life, as well as the big, wide middle ground that ranges between those extremes. In other words, wisdom is about an integrated way of understanding life and ultimately living it too. It's about realizing that there's a time and a place for everything, even the things we dislike and find repugnant. From that perspective, there's a time for love and a time for hate, an occasion for generosity and one for selfishness, a moment for exuberance and joy, and a moment for sorrow and tragedy, a season for life and a season for death. They're all necessary and integral parts of life's larger totality. In that regard, I'd say that wisdom is about being lucidly and unflinchingly aware of reality and about learning to live accordingly. And of course, one of the paradoxes of all of that would be that wisdom also realizes that there's a time and place for its exact opposite, for being foolish and shallow and silly, all of those things. Okay, well, you're probably getting the picture. And so with that rough and approximate definition of wisdom in mind, let's explore some of the reasons why our world needs the Sage Archetype. And I'd say that the first and most obvious one would be that practically all of our world's most serious problems arise out of our lack of wisdom, especially in conjunction with our addiction to the single strongest narcotic on the planet. I'll give you a second to guess what that narcotic is. Fentanyl? Nope. Heroin? Nope. Crystal meth? Nope. Good guesses. But it would actually be self-importance. That's the biggest narcotic in our world these days. And okay, wisdom would also realize that there's a time and place for that too. But that doesn't mean that it has to define the upper limit of our lives or that we have to wallow in it 24/7. After all, if there's a time and a place for our pathologies, there's also a time and a place for moving past them. Anyhow, I'd say that humanity's most serious problems fall into three general and interrelated categories. First, problems relating well to each other. Then, problems relating well to ourselves. And finally, problems relating well to the world more generally, the world out there. So first, problems relating well to each other. That would include a large-scale phenomena like war, genocide, oppression, and the wholesale slaughter and enslavement of our fellow travelers in this world, as well as more everyday occurrences like simple rudeness, judgmentalism, and intolerance. But let's look at a more extreme example first. The genocidal dictators of the world. Gotta love them. So the question is, as a rule, do they seem like wise human beings? And I guess I don't know about you, but to me, most of them don't. Sure, I suppose you could argue that committing genocide is wise because it helps alleviate humanity's problems with overpopulation. But still, to me, most dictators seem like they're really suffering from a form of possession, like they're thoroughly and myopically fixated on their own grandiose plans for the world, their ideologies, their agendas, and most especially, of course, their own self-importance. And they hardly ever seem to be able to see too far beyond that. They hardly ever seem to be guided by any sort of holistic understanding of the larger totality of things, such as other people's right to self-determination or the inherent sacredness of life. Instead, it always ends up being all about them and their like-minded confederates. And here I'd say that's true of infamous world historical dictators like Stalin, Mao, and Hitler. But it's also true of the dictatorial mindset as it appears in our everyday worlds. You know, the whole domineering mentality that wants to control everyone else's opinions, values, and linguistic practices, which I think is pretty common in our world these days. Anyhow, the second big problem would have to do with relating well to ourselves, which would include our difficulties with self-destructive behavior, with addictions, both literal and figurative, with self-sabotage, as well as with our penchant for excuse-making, blame-shifting, and our perennial refusal to assume responsibility for ourselves, all of which only eventuates in our chronic disempowerment in life. But here again, I'd say that wise people hardly ever find themselves mired in those sorts of behaviors, at least not for very long. For instance, People, that's a good example. People who are hell-bent on destroying themselves through methamphetamine addiction don't usually seem very wise, at least not to me. Nor do those of us who are perpetually mired in crass materialism or who indulge in a lot of evasive excuse-making and blame-shifting. Instead, wise people usually seem pretty quick to assume personal responsibility for their problems and for their own betterment in life. For instance, it's pretty rare to hear a wise person bellowing about something like, "My life sucks and it's all your fault," which I'd say is a fairly common lament in our world these days. And finally, the third big problem would have to do with relating well to the world more generally. And here I'd include humanity's collective struggle with overpopulation, which in conjunction with our ever-increasing materialistic greed ends up obliterating more and more of the natural world. I guess it doesn't seem particularly wise to me to be treating our planet like a gigantic garbage dump and sewer, maybe a little bit like in that movie WALL-E. And it doesn't seem particularly wise to be constantly driving more and more species of wildlife into extinction either, so that eventually the only creatures on the planet will be ourselves, the animals we eat, and our pets. Oh, and I guess rats and roaches, but only because we can't ever seem to get rid of them. Basically, it's all about more and more of us and less of everything else. In my view, that trajectory, which also seems to be our current operative one, mostly seems like a product of our runaway self-importance, ignorance, and myopia, not actual wisdom, which would seek a harmonious, sustainable balance between our existence and the existence of all other sentient beings on the planet. But the main point I'm trying to make is that our lack of wisdom is at the root of pretty much all of our major difficulties. And so I'd say that our world needs the Sage Archetype first because it can help us deal with our myriad problems in all three of those domains. First, the sphere of relating well to each other, then the area of relating well to ourselves, and finally, in the realm of relating well to the world more generally. However, at this point, probably the question is, well, okay, but how can the Sage Archetype do that? Well, I'd say that the Sage Archetype can do that by bringing the whole issue of wisdom into our everyday awareness, so that it might eventually occupy a more central place among our values and aspirations. But on the other hand, I'd say that that's definitely an uphill battle at this point in history. For instance, as someone who has spent the last 25 years, actually more than 25, but who's counting, as an academician, I can tell you, fostering wisdom is hardly ever mentioned among education's primary goals. Instead, I'd say that the main academic buzzword these days would be critical thinking. And while it's certainly important to be able to evaluate ideas and issues with a critical eye, that's still very different from actual wisdom. It's almost as if we academicians are so fixated on cultivating the capacities of our intellects that we fail to notice that there's a lot more to life than that. And it's entirely possible to be very smart and erudite and still be a complete and unmitigated disaster as a human being. And that same logic, I think, would apply to the human race as a whole. And all of that seems a bit odd, considering the fact that the entire Western intellectual trajectory began with philosophy, which originally meant love of wisdom. But of course, that strange twist of historical happenstance isn't limited to the domain of academia. In fact, I'd say that wisdom is mostly absent in many other important sectors of our world. It hardly ever appears in politics or in economics or in popular culture. And so I'd say that the second reason why our world needs the Sage archetype would have to do with how it can bring the whole issue of wisdom into our everyday awareness. Especially so, we might learn to care about it and allow it to occupy a more vital place among our values, attitudes, and aspirations. But of course, when we're talking about changes in those areas, what we're really talking about is changing our lives themselves. And with regard to addressing the kinds of problems in our world I mentioned earlier, well, the unpleasant truth is that our world will change only when we ourselves change. When we ourselves become a little bit wiser and a little bit better than we've been in the past. Let me say that again, because I think it bears repetition. Our world will change only when we change. There are no shortcuts, no matter how much we may wish it were otherwise. And here we're up against what I feel is one of the great illusions of our age. Basically, we'd all like our world to be a much better place, with a lot less unnecessary pain and misery, much of it self-inflicted. And so we're usually pretty quick to look to large-scale social institutions like politics and education to accomplish that. But the sad truth is that that's not likely to happen, at least not in any substantial way. Sure, politics and/or education can improve our world a little bit, at least now and then. But in the end, they're not going to make us appreciably wiser. And without wisdom, all of our attempts to improve our world are like polishing the brass on the Titanic, as Tyler Durden once put it. We can't count on politics to make us appreciably wiser because politicians will always end up following the path of their own self-interest, which in turn is about maintaining and amplifying their own access to power, superiority, and control. And fostering wisdom among the populace doesn't accord very well with that agenda. Mostly because wisdom has a nasty habit of revealing just how trivial our power and dominance games really are, especially in comparison to the depth of our souls and the immensity of the cosmos. And as for education, well, education can accomplish only what our world's prevailing political and economic power structures allow it to accomplish. And since it's not really in power's interest to foster too much wisdom among everyday people in the first place, well, it's unlikely that education will ever be able to serve as a reliable vehicle for it, even if it wants to. And here's where I'd say that there's a third reason why our world needs the Sage archetype. It's because the Sage archetype might just possess enough evocative power to draw us toward changing our lives, toward allowing ourselves to become deeper, wiser, and better than we'd otherwise be, and perhaps even more than the power status quo would want us to be. And when all of that starts to happen, hell, we might even be able to serve as living beacons for each other, as living points of reference for our voyages over the storm-tossed seas of this world. And when wisdom starts to become contagious among everyday people in that sort of way, it might even help our entire world become a little bit wiser too. And if all of that starts to sound a little bit like a pipe dream, as it well might, well, consider the fact that we don't actually risk much by trying. And hell, we might just end up gaining a whole lot. Gaining a world and a way of life that's a lot better and a lot brighter than anything we'd ever imagined. However, I'd also say that some portrayals of the Sage archetype are more likely to have that sort of effect than other ones are. For instance, I'd say that one problem with an archetypal figure like Yoda is that he makes wisdom seem so otherworldly that it doesn't even have a human face. A similar problem occurs with Gandalf from Lord of the Rings, who situates wisdom within a fictional realm of hobbits, elves, and wizards that's very far removed from life as we know it. And even actual historical sages like Socrates and Solomon tend to make wisdom seem similarly remote and unattainable, mostly because they're so far removed from our own era that it's hard to relate to them. In that regard, I'd say that archetypal figures like Morpheus are much better. That's Morpheus from the Matrix movies, right? Not the ancient Greek god of dreams. Anyhow, that's because when representations of the Sage Archetype seem more human and accessible, they can more easily give hope and inspiration to the rest of us among the very unwise hoi polloi. In my view, those are the kinds of archetypal representations our world needs, especially because they have the potential to move us toward laying claim to our own capacity for wisdom. However, I think that a fourth and final reason why our world needs the Sage Archetype has to do with the fact that wisdom is one of our highest possible virtues. And here I'd like to make reference to the work of the developmental psychologist Erik Erikson, who proposed that wisdom is actually the virtue associated with the eighth and final stage of our lives, which would be senescence or old age. Of course, it's obvious that not every elderly person becomes wise. That's partly because old age involves a developmental struggle that not everyone negotiates successfully. According to Erikson, that struggle is about retrospectively reviewing all of the major events we've experienced throughout our lives, with an eye toward finding value and meaning in what we've been through. And if we're not able to do that, the alternative is to feel a pervasive sense of despair. Despair about our whole journey through life, like it didn't really add up to much, at least not much that's worthwhile. In other words, the long and circuitous road of human existence eventually leads to the possibility of becoming wise. Of course, that may make wisdom seem like it's just an issue relevant only to older people. You know, basically an okay boomer kind of thing. But that's not really true. After all, when you think about it, how are any of us ever able to reach a successful resolution of that developmental stage, if not by way of living toward successful resolution all the way through our lives? In other words, the best way we can affirm the value of our lives when we're near the end of them is to have lived well all the way through the earlier stages. So I'd say that the question of wisdom is really in the air for all of us, no matter how young or how old. And this leads us to what I think is the fourth and final reason why our world needs the Sage Archetype. It's because it can help us orient ourselves toward fulfilling one of our deepest human possibilities, which in turn can help us consummate our time in this life. Ultimately, our world needs the Sage Archetype because life is always calling us toward becoming what we can become, toward fulfilling our first and best destinies in this world. And I'd say that that same logic applies to the human race as a whole. And that, I'd say, is perhaps the best reason, the most powerful reason for the Sage Archetype of all. Whew. Okay, so anyhow, yeah, thanks as always for taking the time out of your day to listen and watch. I appreciate that sacrifice, which I hope has proven to be at least a marginally wise one. Oh, and by the way, it's usually good to bear in mind the etymology of the word sacrifice, which is to make holy. So yeah, I appreciate your sacrifice in all senses of the word. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.